in English, and after that, I'm going to read the same information in Spanish for all who are here that speak Spanish. And I would like to welcome all of you. I'm presenting Shannon Drysdale Walsh. She's an associate professor of political science at the University of Minnesota Duluth. She's an affiliated faculty member with the Interdisciplinary Center of the Study of Global Change in the University of Minnesota. She has also been a visiting scholar at the University of North Carolina at the Chapel Hill Department of Political Science during the summer and fall of 2015. And also had been a residential research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at the University of Minnesota in 2021. Her research explained variation in state response to violence against women, focusing on Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Her scholarship analyzed how countries with few resources and long-standing patterns of discrimination against women make institutional advances that facilitate implementation of laws addressing domestic violence, rape, and femicide. A core finding of this research is that the women's transnational advocacy networks have provided necessarily political pressure and financial resources to help strengthen the rule of law for women in Central America. However, despite these positive impacts, these institutions are fragile, prone to reversal and failure, and impunity remains widespread. International donor involvement can also be problematic for local advocacy. In addition to what I mentioned, Dr. Drysdale produced a scholarship on women's policymaking, Central American migration and immigration, sex trafficking in the United States, and crime in Latin America. She has engaged in advocacy work in rural communities in Guatemala and served as a consultant and expert witness for asylum cases in the United States. She has published her work in several important and very recognized international journals. Hago un switch al español. Shannon Drysdale Walsh es profesora asociada de Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad de Minnesota Duluth. Es miembro de la facultad afiliada del Centro Interdisciplinario para el Estudio del Cambio Global de la Universidad de Minnesota y ha sido profesora visitante en el Departamento de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad del Norte de Carolina, en el campus Chapel Hill. También ha sido becaria en el Instituto de Estudios Avanzados de la Universidad de Minnesota. Y su investigación se enfoca en explicar las variaciones de la respuesta estatal a la violencia contra las mujeres en Centroamérica, especialmente en Guatemala, Nicaragua y Costa Rica. Sus estudios analizan cómo los países con pocos recursos y con patrones de discriminación de larga data contra las mujeres realizan avances institucionales que facilitan la implementación de leyes que abordan la violencia doméstica, la violación y el femicidio. Una de las principales conclusiones de esta investigación es de que las redes transnacionales de defensa de los derechos de la mujer han ejercido presión política y recursos financieros necesarios para ayudar a fortalecer el Estado de Derecho de las mujeres en Centroamérica. Sin embargo, a pesar de estos impactos positivos, estas instituciones son frágiles y propensas a los retrocesos y fracasos. La impunidad sigue siendo un fenómeno generalizado. Por otro lado, ella nos señala que la participación de donantes internacionales o de la cooperación internacional puede ser problemática para el desarrollo y el trabajo de la Defensoría de los Derechos de las Mujeres a nivel local. La doctora Drysdale. También ha hecho sus contribuciones a la formulación de políticas para la protección de los derechos de la mujer, temas de migración e inmigración centroamericana, tráfico sexual en Estados Unidos y delincuencia en América Latina. Ha trabajado en la defensa de los derechos y de la conciencia de derechos y la educación en derechos en zonas rurales de Guatemala, y ha sido también consultora en la elaboración de peritajes en caso de asilo en Estados Unidos. Y su trabajo pues es publicado en revistas conocidas a nivel internacional e indexadas. Entonces, bueno, yo aquí pararía la introducción de Shannon, que es una valiosa académica feminista, y pues me congració mucho de poder compartir este espacio en línea organizado por la Red Interamericana Antifeminicidio, donde mi colega Claire Parkine es pues co-organizadora. Entonces, Shannon, pues te dejo el escenario para que compartas tu presentación con nosotras. Y bienvenida.
Muchas gracias, Dolores. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I'm so grateful to Claire for organizing this talk and also bringing together scholars and advocates committed to reducing these high levels of femicide in Latin America through the Red Interamericana Antifemicidio. I'm really happy to see a lot of close colleagues, old friends, and new friends here. So gracias a todas por asistir y también por tomar tiempo estar aquí. And thank you for everyone for coming. I'll stop interpreting, Claire. Thank you everyone for coming, for taking time from your really busy lives to spend some time together to talk about these issues. So I'll ask people to post questions along the way in chat, and then we'll save them for the end so that we have time for a nice question and answer session. And Claire, just pop in and let me know if you have anything to add. Is this a good pace, or can I go faster, or are we good? Good? Okay. Awesome. Okay. So in terms of the project and an overview of the project, we often hear of failures in Central American countries that have contributed to people fleeing and seeking asylum. No surprise to anyone here. And Honduras and El Salvador have some of the highest homicide rates and femicide rates in the world. As you know, Central America has varying levels, but high levels of poverty, inequality, and so on. And there are really high rates of impunity for killings of women, in which less than 10% of cases get prosecuted across most Central American countries. Over the past decades, there have been various advances, and some of which are quite puzzling and get less attention. And on one of my first trips to Central America in 2002, I learned about women's police stations, specialized police stations staffed by women to address violence against women and children in Nicaragua. So the question of this research project is asking, how did this happen? How did these police stations emerge in one of the poorest countries in Latin America? And also, more broadly, how do countries in Latin America that have now created progressive policies to confront high levels of violence against women and femicide experience reversals in these institutions? So I want to start by sharing a story from the field from 2012. And when I was in Managua, Nicaragua, and I love being in Nicaragua, and especially Managua at the time, because people are very easygoing, love to chat, have a casual conversation. And in the United States, I'm a Southerner, which means I like doing the same. And so on a really early morning, I went to the women's police station to make observations and do interviews with police officers. But the most interesting interview I had that day was completely unplanned. It was just a chat with a woman who was waiting outside the police station. And security alarms were ringing everywhere, and people were briskly passing by. And I was sitting on a rock outside the entrance to one of the women's police stations. And the police officers told me that there was something wrong with the alarm system. And so the station would have to open up once they got it fixed. And Rosa, which is a pseudonym, but she's a woman that I met, walked up and took a seat right next to me. And as other people started to gather, waiting for the police station to open. And she told me that she had come for yet another visit to the women's police station to have them help process her domestic violence case. And so she told me with this tone of great resignation that her husband had beaten her repeatedly. And this was a replay of victimization that she and her mother had endured earlier in life. And so Rosa, who was on her way to work, trying to support her children as a single mother, was really anxious for the station to open. And she said she was glad that she'd been assigned a pro bono lawyer, but she doubted it would help very much because her husband had money and he could afford to hire 3 different private lawyers. I asked her if the police had been really helpful. And she said, well, I'm glad that they were there. But she noted that it was really difficult to wait for service when you have children and you have work, and the police stations are always busy. And Rosa decided to leave about 5 minutes before they fixed the alarm system, and the station opened about an hour late. And so even though this wasn't a typical day, Rosa was having some of the many typical frustrations with the police and the justice system. The police were always very busy. The small waiting areas were standing room only, with lots of children that were there, but missing out on other opportunities to play or to learn. And the process that a lot of women experienced with the police stations, even at that time, which I would say was at their best compared to now, was really re-victimizing, because women had inevitably had to make multiple trips and repeatedly tell their story of their victimization to different people. So the state, which is supposed to be empowering women through this process, was in fact disempowering them by requiring them to use these few resources that they have, the time and the money, and the time and the money that they had to get there, when they were already in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. So it was forcing them to pay for services with their sheer effort under difficult circumstances. And so 2012 was the year when I talked to Rosa, but this was the year when the Progressive Violence Against Women law was created in Nicaragua. 2012 was also when a Sandinista majority was voted into Congress, while Sandinista President Daniel Ortega was in office, and Sandinistas started this process of undermining women's rights with the reversal of the Violence Against Women law very shortly after it was created in 2012. And I point to this as the beginning of a democratic backsliding in Nicaragua, starting in part with undermining the rights of 50% of the population as a canary in the coal mine, or a sign of what was to come. Democratic backsliding has led now to full-scale crisis and a decline in democracy. Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega recently was elected to a 4th term in 2021 with more than 75% of the votes, but only did so after imprisoning most of his political rivals throughout 2021. And so this is a context that is not unconnected between women's rights and democracy. So most of you probably know a lot about Nicaragua, and likely more about Nicaragua than I do. But Here are some key facts for those of you who don't know Nicaragua as well, that Nicaragua is one of the poorest countries in Latin America. It's known for the 1979 Sandinista Revolution, where Sandinistas overthrew a 3-generation Somoza dictatorship and were in government throughout the 1980s, fighting the U.S.-funded Contras in the Contra War. And then in the 1980s, the Sandinistas were known for progressive economic policies aiming to bring people out of poverty. Women participated in large numbers in the Sandinista Revolution and also in the subsequent Sandinista government. But the Sandinistas as a whole, outside of women, were not particularly progressive regarding women, and even even though they had a strong feminist contingent that came up through the 1980s, I would agree with most scholars that there is this really strong core of anti-feminist Sandinistas. So for this particular research, bit of my research, I want to look at both the passing and the reversal of the Law 779. And so in 2012, Nicaragua passed Law 779, which is the comprehensive law on violence against women. But the government subsequently dismantled its progressive elements through reform in 2013 called El Reglamento. For those of you who don't know what a reglamento is, it's a regulation. And this, it's kind of like implementation mechanisms in US law. But this regulation that was passed radically changed the focus of the law from protecting women to protecting families, and reversed several key feminist aims of the law. Nicaragua's violence against women law followed decades of women's advocacy to create it. It passed unanimously, despite a socio-political context that was dominated by conservatives. Like other laws in the region, it referenced international and regional conventions that address violence against women. It states that the law applies to both the public and the private sphere. And beyond many other laws in the region, it recognizes psychological violence as a crime and included new forms of violence against women, like economic violence and misogyny. It defined femicide, which is murder motivated by gender, motivated by misogyny, as a crime in the context of unequal power relations between men and women, which carried more severe penalties, so 15 to 30 years in prison. And the law also mandated the creation of specialized courts to address gender violence. So with all of these statutes, it was particularly progressive at the time compared to other laws in Latin America addressing violence against women. However, in 2013 and 2014, government-led reforms radically changed the aim of the law as well as its implementation mechanisms from violence against women to violence against families. So most of the protections and penalties that were originally meant to protect female victims were stripped from the law. These reversed not only the core elements of the 2012 law, but also dismantled many violence against women protocols developed in the preceding 25 years. So this foreshadowed an authoritarian turn in the Sandinista government. This authoritarian turn became really evident with outright repression against citizens that escalated into abuse, arrests, and extrajudicial killings in the spring of 2018. So despite international pressure to refrain from human rights violations, the Ortega regime has clung to power as of 2022 with an increasingly repressive grip. And in retrospect, the invulnerability to external influence regarding the implementation of the 779 law was a canary in the coal mine, indicative of a government that was increasingly authoritarian, more generally cutting itself off from external influence, not only domestic influence, but also international influence. And lack of accountability to external actors is an indicator of and a precursor to democratic decay. So while this radical shift is unique in many ways to Nicaragua, it's not uncommon for governments to be less vulnerable to influence over how a law is implemented once it's created. So Nicaraguan, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead so we can get to the main argument here. So through this case study of the 779 law in Nicaragua, I confirmed some major findings in existing scholarship on the creation of women's policies and provide additional evidence that a few key factors make progressive policies more likely to pass. And what are those key factors? One, when there's vulnerability and openness to external pressure. So specifically, when a government cares to improve or maintain its country's reputation and standing in the international community, as well as to domestic actors. Secondly, when there's inclusion of progressive domestic and international policy advocates in the policymaking process. So most countries passing progressive violence against women laws, autonomous women's movement organizations are important for bringing violence against women laws to the policy agenda, but struggle to be effective if they aren't included in the policymaking process. Third, advocacy from key government actors. So there needs to be a foothold within the state. And since progressive advocates within the state are often working against opposition, they can amplify their effectiveness through collaboration with key allies within the state, such as within women's policy agencies, within Congress, and so on. And they can also collaborate with international and domestic women's organizations to demonstrate and leverage external support and bring pressure to political opponents. So together, these groups work as transnational advocacy networks that promote causes, ideas, and norms of women's rights. One reason that progressive networks are necessary is because they're working against existing rival groups. In the case of Nicaragua, I call these rival groups conservatives, and they have vigorously opposed progressive laws regarding women's rights and specifically this violence against women law. So even though conservative opposition exists and has often delayed the creation of violence against women laws, during this creation stage, this opposition may be weak or latent. And in part, this is because they may anticipate implementation failures and also don't want to be appearing blatantly anti-women. Women do make up 50% of the voters, and coming out and saying that you're against violence against women law can be politically risky in that sense. So to explain progressive policy dismantling or reversal, I argue that the opposite conditions make dismantling likely in a context of policy rivals and often prevail after progressive policies are created. So here you can see a chart. I don't know, can you see this? I don't know if you can see, but you can see a model where the conditions in the policy making stage make progressive policy more likely, and then reversal of these conditions often happen when the opposite reversal of these laws can happen when the opposite conditions prevail. And so reversal of progressive policy is likely when there's reduced vulnerability to external pressure, exclusion of progressive policy advocates, reduced advocacy from key government actors in the face of increased pressure from conservative opposition. So the context of policy rivals is common as a context in which the creation of violence against women laws happen. And in Nicaragua, progressive networks are what I call the transnational advocacy networks focused on violence against women. And conservatives are those conservative groups that promote family values, or what they call family values, or family unity. They're the folks who argue that women's attempting to leave abusive men is a threat to family unity. And on the other hand, progressives argue that men's abuse is the real threat to family well-being. So even policies on violence against women are certainly not as contentious as abortion law, but even these policies are contested. Okay. So evidence from Nicaragua for creating the 779 law. I won't go into a ton of detail, and we can talk about these things during the Q&A. But the 779 law was created at a key moment when Nicaragua was vulnerable to mounting international pressure to modernize and become more gender progressive. So people theorized that the executive supported the law because they were under international pressure to create the appearance of becoming a woman-friendly state and conform to violence against women laws in the region. Two reasons for this is that in 1999, Ortega was credibly accused by his stepdaughter of years of sexual abuse in a case that ultimately went to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Another reason is that in 2006, 2007, the Sandinista Party and Ortega supported a total abortion ban, which generated a lot of international opposition and scrutiny. And so this opened up Nicaragua and made them a little bit more vulnerable to international pressure at the time. Second, progressive, domestic, and international advocates were included in the policy process. And one reason for this was the international donors were helping to fund both the Maria Elena Cuadra, which was the a women's organization, at the same time as they were funding the Supreme Court to hold meetings and come up with proposals to create a violence against women law. Another reason, another way international advocates were included in the policy process is that they were giving international donor support, and that gave the women's movement from the ground up more leverage and power in the initial stages of the policy making process. But this funding wasn't there after the law was created. Then there was also advocacy from key government actors willing to advance the progressive law. So Wilfredo Navarro through the PLC was an opposition part of the Sandinistas to actually ally with the women's movement and propose the law. And then at the time, internal and external conservative opposition was relatively latent. So even though a lot of representatives who ultimately passed the law were conservative, they did so anyway, saying later, oh, I didn't really support this, but I didn't want to appear in favor of violence against women. Okay. There was also an incentive to showcase the law so that Nicaragua would have a good reputation regarding its treatment of women for the international community. And so the beginning of this backlash started in the kind of in the newspapers and in the streets with this mobilization of conservatives. So conservative actors of the Catholic and evangelical churches and a group of lawyers called the Nicaraguan Association of Democratic Lawyers, ADANIC, were the key public opponents of the law. So within the government, there was vocal opposition from First Lady Rosario Murillo and conservatives within the Sandinista Party. There was also opposition within the Supreme Court and the National Assembly that became evident in their support for reforming the law. And a small but vocal group of conservatives took to the media and argued that 779 law undermined family values, and it was also unconstitutional because it would create inequality against men. So here you see Catholic Archbishop Abelardo Mata that spoke out against the law, saying, we have said repeatedly that the mark of the devil is no longer 666. It is now 779. because this law is destroying families. And how many times have people who accused a husband, uncle, or cousin out of anger or revenge then said, once the storm has passed, that they have been too hard on them, and so decided to drop the case. But this conservative opposition was not the whole story of the dismantling. One of the key features of 1779 was to exclude the option to mediate conflicts between abusers and their victims. But 1 year after the creation of 779, Congress approved Law 846, which was the first step in dismantling 779. And this mandated the inclusion of mediation within the law in order to safeguard family unity. So Law 846 gave the president the power to regulate and implement the law, which is very unusual. With this reform, women could voluntarily accept mediation with her aggressor, and this, on the face of it, for most people, might not seem so radical in the face of it, until people start to explain its impacts in practice. So shortly before this reform was approved, the women's movement, of course, spoke out against it, and they explained why mediation was prohibited in the original 779 law. So Acelia Solis notes, she says that evidence shows that after mediation agreements were reached with aggressors, it reinforced their abusive practices against the women and subjected them to reprisals. Far from halting the violence, mediation caused it to intensify, leading to greater damage, and in the worst of cases, the women's death. And the social message the state is sending out with this reform is deadly. So this is Acelia Solis. And so pictured here is the organization in Nicaragua, you may know, Si Mujer, with a banner saying no to mediation, yes to Law 779. But these arguments fell upon deaf ears, and the reform was approved. So the second stage of dismantling was through the executive. And here's Daniel Ortega with his wife and Vice President Rosario Murillo. In 2014, President Daniel Ortega directed the second phase of dismantling the Violence Against Women law, which occurred through an executive decree called a reglamento. So again, this is a legal document that specifies how the law will be implemented. It's not a legally authorized mechanism for changing the law itself, but it's meant to implement the law as written. So Ortega misused the reglamento in order to rewrite the law, excluding women's civil society organizations and bypassing the need for approval by the National Assembly to make additional changes to the law. So the rewriting of this was unilaterally imposed with this family values perspective, and made profound changes to its aims and implementation. While the original objective of the 779 law was to act against violence, it was to act against violence that is exercised against women. In the post-reglamento version, Law 779 is written to guarantee the strengthening of Nicaraguan families. In addition, the reglamento restricted the application of the law to the private sphere, whereas the original law enabled its application to both the private as well as the public sphere. And it also restricted the definition of femicide from a crime that could be committed in the public or private sphere to one that's committed in the context of interpersonal or male-female partner violence. Even more radical than this were the modifications to implementation. So according to the reglamento, women who were considered to have light or leve cases of violence, where there are no immediate or obvious signs of physical injury, will be asked if they would like to mediate their cases through family councils instead of reporting them to police stations. And so in practice, women began to be discouraged even from initially reporting crimes against them. So this evidence for Nicaragua in reversing the 779 law is that Nicaragua became less vulnerable and open to external pressure. At the time, they were also increasing regime consolidation. Second, they were excluding, and also part of this process of consolidating the regime, they were excluding progressive domestic and international policy advocates from the policymaking process. There was weakened advocacy from the key government actors willing to advance the progressive law. We can talk more about this later if you want to know details. And there became more active conservative opposition after the law was created. What were the impacts on victims? Women's police stations with auxiliary services were shut down and replaced by family councils, and reorienting the new women's police stations to focusing on family security. In 2020, Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo, started a campaign called the Women for Life campaign and took credit for now reopening women's police stations after having them shut down in the first place. And so this new vision is to have police with the objective of providing accompaniment or mediation and security to families facing situations of violence. So see how different that perspective is from a feminist perspective. So this removes the agency and responsibility away from men abusing women. And so it now appears that these women's police stations are merely a window dressing for the state's vision of violence against women as a question of family unity and interpersonal problems, rather than focusing on strengthening women's autonomy. And so this puts back the function of women's police stations 30 plus years. Some conclusions, so we can wrap up and have our time for Q&A. Is it like many other countries around the world, Nicaragua is a context of policy rivals. I would even describe the United States that way, of course, increasingly so now. So pressure external to the state in Nicaragua as a developing country has been quite necessary for advancing progressive policy reform, precisely because powerful rivals inside and outside the state resist these changes. And don't forget that the United States is not immune from these kinds of problems. United States is a country that has never signed CEDAW because it's immune to this kind of international pressure. So in this paper, I'm demonstrating that the conditions that promote progressive policies are more likely to be present at the policy creation stage, but less likely to be present at the policy implementation stage, making progressive policies particularly vulnerable to reversal when there's reduced vulnerability to external pressure, and when there's reduced exclusion, when there's increased exclusion of progressive policy advocates, and when there's reduced advocacy from key government actors in the face of increased pressure from political opposition. These put progressive policies at risk of reversal. So one implication of this research is that inclusion of marginalized groups is necessary to create policies that address their needs and rights. Another implication is that it's important for international donors to contribute funding to policy implementation to sustain these policies after they're created, after they provided funding to support them and get them on the books. And an obvious point for this audience is that reversals of progressive violence against women laws meant to empower women is putting women at increased risk of femicide. So in a context where family unity is prioritized above women's safety, men are more empowered to continue abusing women in a context of impunity, and women being unable to escape abuse, unable to even use the state as a last resort, puts them at high risk of being murdered by abusive partners. And this is a pattern that's observed worldwide. So what should be done about this in a context of global economic stagnation and inflation? We need to continue pressing and supporting international donor funding for grassroots advocates, continue grassroots advocacy for strengthening democracy and strengthening women's rights, protect women and protect advocates who are at risk of being thrown in jail for doing this kind of work. But given the state of the global economy, donor funding is likely to decline, leaving an already vulnerable population and other populations at even higher risk of increased poverty and violence. And another implication of this, and finally, is one of regime consolidation and moves towards authoritarianism are dangerous for women in the face of anti-women regimes. Okay, so I will wrap it up there. And thank you to Claire Brannigan and the Red Interamericana, Antifemicidio, and everybody for coming. And I look forward to a discussion and Q&A.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for your presentation. Thank you for your thoughts and your vision, your critical vision on Nicaragua. And